Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Joining myself today on the podcast, we have the wildlife chair of the Sierra Club, from the Colorado chapter. She's joining us from Redstone, Colorado, pertinent to our conversation, which is on the west slope in the White River National Park in Colorado. Delia Malone. Delia, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm glad we fought through our technical difficulties before, but it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. We spoke with Mike Phillips a couple of episodes ago to really get involved in the Colorado reintroduction, how things are coming along there, and how it really how it started and how it's moving forward. But I really want to get some background from you about your involvement. You're with the Sierra Club now. I believe you're still at Colorado State University. So you have a very rich background in this. So if you don't mind, please give everybody who's listening a little bit of background on yourself and how you got involved.
Sure. I am an ecologist, and I work for the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which is housed at Colorado State University. Importantly, I am speaking not for Colorado Natural Heritage Program. I am speaking for myself and for the Colorado chapter of the Sierra Club. So that's important to remember. But my several decades with the Heritage Program has been what has enabled me to get a on-the-ground perspective of Colorado's wildlands and the condition that our wildlands are in. So what I do as an ecologist, I conduct biological surveys across Colorado for rare plants and animals and natural communities for the purpose of assessing their condition and ultimately for conserving those natural habitats and the species that they require. And so in those years, I've been able to walk and go to places where most people don't go. And what I've found, what I've assessed, is that first, we have vast wildlands that most humans never see, that most humans never visit, which is important because there's this concept in Colorado that we are too populated for wolves. I would push back strongly on that idea. Every year, I see the places and there is ample room for wolves. What I've also seen and assessed and documented is that much of those wildlands are in not pristine shape. They have not been managed sustainably. They need help. And that's where wolves can make a huge difference.
So I love what you're saying, and we'll jump right into it because I printed out an opinion piece that you did not too long ago. I believe it was in 2020. It was either right before the vote for Prop 114, before it was passed. And you really touch on that subject, which you just said, is that the wildlands, much, I guess, to relate to Yellowstone, where the lands weren't managed, I guess, properly by the species that were there currently and possibly by the humans that were supposed to be managing the lands there. Do you see any of similarities in the Colorado places that you see on a regular basis that can relate to Yellowstone and how those places were before reintroduction of wolves that thinned out the elk and the bears came back and so on and so forth?
Absolutely, there's a parallel. And again, I think that the idea that there's not a parallel is not based on fact. It's based on myth, either deliberately or not. We have vast wildlands. They have clearly been impacted by inappropriate livestock grazing. There is no doubt about that. That doesn't mean that can't be changed. They've also been, our wildlands in Colorado have been impacted by unsustainable elk and ungulate management, which can also be modified if we can restore what in the jargon is ecologically effective populations of wolves. That is, sufficient numbers of wolves in family packs that are well distributed throughout Colorado. So I think Yellowstone is an excellent model for us. The difference between Yellowstone, one of the differences between Yellowstone and the west slope of Colorado, the wildlands on the west slope of Colorado, is that carnivores are protected. We see a full suite of carnivores in Yellowstone. We don't see that in Colorado. We see a situation where carnivores are still considered a negative influence. And that is one of the big myths, huge myths that we need to dispel. And so people will say, well, Colorado isn't Yellowstone. No, it's not, but certainly something we could strive for. It is certainly something that we can look to say, oh, look, we actually can restore a natural balance, and it's not that hard to do. I think the most difficult aspect of restoring a natural balance is changing hearts and minds to the view that large carnivores are critical. Wolves need elk just as much as elk need wolves.
So what are some of the things that you see ecologically that bring you, and I imagine your colleagues, to these ideas that they ecologically Colorado needs some restoration help? What are some of the things that you've seen? I read in some of the articles, plant life by the rivers and streams is a little isn't in great shape. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a lot of what we saw in Yellowstone before a lot of those things were restored. Is it similar in that way, or are there different ecological issues that you see in Colorado?
No, you're absolutely right. The ecological issues are very similar. And I want to say right up front that a lot of folks will say that Yellowstone and the Northern Rockies are not equivalent to Colorado. I would say, as an ecologist, from an ecological point of view, there's a lot of similarities. Foundationally, the ecosystems are very similar. Ecological processes are similar. They are not different. Yes, our climate's a bit different, and we have some differences, but the foundational ecological processes are very similar. So we can use Yellowstone and Banff and Algonquin as good models of what could happen. So ecologically, what we're seeing in Colorado, and probably even more importantly, is we are experiencing a warming climate, and the impacts of a warming climate are very noticeable in Colorado, particularly on the west slope. So what we're seeing, and I'm going to do a fast forward through history here, real briefly, but to give a real kind of perspective on this, is that beginning with our soils, and soil isn't too exciting, but it is hugely important. And so maintaining healthy soils that can sequester carbon, that can store water, is essential to its foundation to our ecosystems. It provides the foundation to vegetation, which of course is what sustains the elk and sustains the deer and provides habitat for birds and provides the roots that hold on to the soils along the edges of streams that keep streams healthy. So what we're seeing in Colorado on the west slope and on the Front Range as well, but we're focusing in on the west slope because that's where wolves will be, is that we've undermined the very foundation of our ecosystems. And so we see our forests being degraded, our forest health being diminished. We see streams downcut and dying. And of course, those headwater streams at higher elevations are the source of the streams for the Colorado River, the flows in the Colorado River, which we're seeing diminish dramatically. So that this year, for the first year in 100, we may not be able to meet our obligation to downstream states to provide them with the water that they were guaranteed. So beginning with our soils and our vegetation, we are seeing a diminishment of ecosystem health. So what does that have to do with wolves? Well, everything. And not just wolves, but wolves are part of the process of the creation of healthy, sustainable ecosystems. Everything is connected. And wolves can and do initiate trophic cascades, which enable the restoration of the connections between different species that provide ecosystem stability. So how do wolves do that? Very simply put, wolves moderate the browsing of large ungulates like deer and elk so that vegetation can recover. And when vegetation can recover, there's healthy forests, which provide the habitat for all of the other critters in the system. When elk are moved around by wolves or by lions, for instance, the vegetation along the stream sides can recover and provide the sustainability to stream banks. Streams are healthy. Water stays in the streams, providing habitat for fish, for toads, for waterfowl, and those ecosystem effects cascade throughout the system, restoring the connections that maintain ecosystem stability. What we've done in Colorado is that we've removed a key element of the ecosystem processes, carnivores. Carnivores are just as essential to ecosystem health as are the trees and the birds and all of the other components.
So when you say the carnivores, we're talking about the full range. We're talking about bears, I imagine mountain lions, wolves. Are those the three main carnivores that Colorado has seen those populations dip and really recede in the last however many decades and years? Are those the three that are really the drivers for this trophic cascade that Colorado's looking to try and restore?
At different levels, those are the large carnivores, but we've also seen a decline in smaller carnivores, the swift foxes and the kit foxes and the lynx and the bobcat. They're all critical. Focusing back on gray wolves are a keystone carnivore. So in the ecological jargon, a keystone species is simply a species that has an inordinately large impact, large and positive impact on ecosystem processes in comparison to their relatively small abundance. So just a few wolves can and do have a large impact, large and positive impact on the rest of the ecosystem. The other carnivores are critical as well. Cougars, bobcat, lynx, and so on. But wolves had an inordinately large and positive impact. So that's why there's been such a focus on restoring wolves. We see biodiversity crashing across our planet. In my mind, in the mind of a lot of ecologists, one of the most important things that we can do is to restore those keystone species, those species that do have and can kind of jumpstart the system so that we can begin a restoration instead of our degradation of biological diversity.
What was the history of wolves in Colorado? I didn't do as much research on this because I wanted to get your take, because I'm sure you have more of an idea than I do. what was the situation with wolf populations in Colorado up to this point? I know, obviously, if we go back, a couple hundred years, I'm sure they were all over Colorado and all over the West. But what has been the population or the recovery efforts like, say, in the last 50 years or so with wolves, or just what's their history in that state?
So a brief history. In Colorado, interestingly enough, was kind of the center of the wolf eradication campaign back in the 1880s. Colorado, by virtue of being kind of the queen city of the West, where the railroads came to, railroads not only brought people, they brought livestock. And when the livestock were dumped into Colorado and across the West, of course, there was this part about bringing people for mining and logging and so on. And with that, we saw the rapid demise of most of the ungulates throughout the West. In fact, in Colorado, elk were gone by the early 1900s, and the elk that we see in Colorado today were introduced from Yellowstone National Park. They were the elk and the deer and obviously the bison, pronghorn, bighorn were virtually eradicated for market hunting to feed all of the people that had come. And so when the wolves' natural prey had been eliminated by us, they, of course, being the smart critters that they are and the hungry critters that they were, turned to feeding on what replaced natural prey, which was livestock. And so by virtue of Colorado being central in the railway, we were also central in the eradication of wolves. The last wolf in Colorado was killed down in the San Juan Mountains in 1945. Since that time, we've seen the loss of many other species. The last grizzly was killed in Colorado in 1974. And our cougar population is vastly diminished from what it once was. The restoration of wolves really began, people started thinking about this in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And probably the most front and center organization was a group called Sinapu. And some of the people that are involved currently in wolf restoration in Colorado were involved in Sinapu way back when, including Michael Robinson from Center for Biodiversity, Rob Edwards, who's with the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. I was on their board back in 1993, 94. So we're seeing a lot of the old guard coming back. We never really gave it up. We just kind of reconnoitered and came back. So that's kind of a brief history of the past and our efforts finally coming to fruition, because we all came together, and we all kind of came together under the guidance, the leadership of Mike Phillips from the Turner Endangered Species Fund. So he kind of orchestrated us all into a concert to howl yes to restore wolves to Colorado.
It seems like a fairly powerful coalition of individuals, yourself, Mike Phillips, and the others that you named just before. And when we spoke with Mike, I think what a lot of he was trying to drive home was the importance of fact-based information and trying to give that information to the public and make sure that he really drove home that it was he wants people to make an informed vote so that they have all the facts there. Was that really what was being disseminated to all of you when you go out? I mean, what was your task leading up to the vote for Prop 114? Were you doing the same thing going into, I don't know if you're going to universities, were you going to assemblies, trying to just tell individuals the actual facts about the restoration? Because I know those lines can get blurred about why exactly, why now, and why put this to a vote to regular people and not biologists and politicians and things of that sort.
Absolutely. So I am also an educator, and I teach conservation biology and I teach ecology at a local community college in their sustainability program. And I think what I've learned from my students is that what they appreciate most is the ability to form their own decisions from good, solid, uh, fact based, evidence based, peer reviewed science. So, taking my lesson from my students to out to the public back in about 2014, with the under the auspices of the Colorado chapter of the Sierra Club, we started a very robust, fact-based outreach program to the entire community of Colorado, not just the choir, but to everyone, reaching out with good science, science that is accessible and understandable and applicable to everyone's situation, everyone's circumstance, everyone's community here in Colorado. So we reached out to the ranching community, to the hunting community, to educational venues, including elementary schools, high schools, colleges, garden clubs, and everybody in between. Church groups were a key, talking about the concepts of creation care with taking care of the entire creation. So we hoped to see everybody and visit everybody with discussions, with films, with webinars, bringing in people. So we had what I really was focused on doing was getting to every corner of Colorado, to every community in Colorado with solid science-based information so that people could make their own decisions about wolf restoration.
I find that so important because we've really touched, Stephen and myself, we've touched on this topic multiple times in really as we get closer, we talk with individuals like yourself from Colorado and others from Wisconsin, really about reaching across the aisle, whichever aisle that may be, whether you're pro-wolf or anti-wolf in some way or another, however deep those feelings run on either side. And it seems as though this restoration in particular in Colorado is that there were people willing at least to listen on both sides. I don't know how much information that was disseminated from all of you to everyone else changed their opinion. But like you said, I feel it's so important that you're there at least presenting the facts and at least giving individuals the choice and leaving their minds open to make an educated choice and a fact-based choice as opposed to going off emotion and feeling, which sometimes can muddy the waters in these situations.
Yes, very important, particularly in this situation, because it is such a long-term cultural norm that has informed what people's decisions are. In this idea about wolves, Gemini, for hundreds of years, people have been imbued with this idea that carnivores are evil, from Little Red Riding Hood and so on and so forth. I think an important something that I'd like to touch on is that the idea that our cultural norms are often so dramatically different from the cultural norms of the Native Americans in North America. The indigenous communities, and I don't want to in any way paint the Native American communities as the same. They're very much different, but we do see a common thread of respect and appreciation and valuing the natural world for itself, not for what it can do for us. And so a big part, an important part of our outreach was to and with the Native American communities in Colorado. And in that way, I learned so much about other perspectives, about what the Native Americans can bring to us, what we can learn to them, and kind of this really interesting coming together, realizing that our science, which is new compared to their indigenous perspectives, which are very old, have so much in common. We are just beginning to realize, Aldo Leopold, sort of our guru of conservation biology, really just came to these ideas in the 1940s that indeed we're all connected. The indigenous communities have known this forever. And so there is this kind of coming together, very real, not a very emotional, but also very real understanding that our science really just supports what a lot of Native American communities have known for a very long time.
Yeah, you basically answered the next question I was going to have, is the impact of those Native American tribes. And it's beautiful to have this conversation with you about those tribes in Colorado, because in speaking with a couple of individuals from Wisconsin, we were told the same effect was happened in Wisconsin, and how the influence of the tribes really with the science is starting to bridge the gap to even some of those who may still be on the fence one way or the other about the restoration or the management, more so in Wisconsin as opposed to the restoration here in Colorado. So when you get to that point where the vote happens, the vote is passed, what is the reaction overall? Because it was a very slim margin, it did pass. But what's the overall reaction after the dust has settled and everyone is aware that this restoration is going to happen, but that you have some time to basically do it right and make sure that all inputs are received? So what's the general feeling when that passed in January, correct?
It passed in November.
It passed in November.
It was the November 2020, the 2020 election, along with all of those other elections that brought in a new day. I think my reaction, and I think everybody's reaction, regardless of whether you voted for or against wolf restoration, is that we do need to get it right. And we have an opportunity in Colorado to look at the Great Lakes states, to look at the Northern Rockies, and to lead by example. Many of the examples are bad examples, in my opinion. From an ecological opinion, many of those examples up in the Northern Rockies in particular, outside of Yellowstone National Park and outside of those areas that are protected, are not taking advantage of what we've learned in the science. I think in Colorado, we have an opportunity to use what we've learned in the Northern Rockies. For instance, one of the things we've learned is that getting along with wolves, living together with wolves, with livestock and wolves specifically, is possible. It is, and it's not hard. It's fairly easy. Consider that in the last year where good data was from the federal government, consider that in 2015, with about 2 million livestock in the Northern Rockies in wolf country, and with about 2,000 wolves close in with livestock in wolf country in the Northern Rockies, there were 148 confirmed losses. That's not many. What we've learned is that by using so-called coexistence or conflict avoidance strategies, livestock and wolves can live together on the landscape. Yes, it will take us to some changes, and it's hard for us to change, whether it's fashion or how we manage livestock. It's difficult for humans to change, but it's possible, and the rewards can be great. So we've learned that. We've learned, and we can take that. I hope that we can take what we've learned up in the Northern Rockies after 20 years of living with wolves and bring that to Colorado. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know how to do this. We know how to do it right. We've learned that wolves can have a very positive impact on elk populations. Chronic wasting disease is rampant in Colorado. Elk, absolutely, we know from 50 years of data that wolves selectively remove the sick and the weak and the vulnerable. Elk herds get healthier. Deer herds get healthier. So we can use those lessons. We can bring that to Colorado. We know, and I will say that our outreach before the election and now is due to a coalition of numerous groups. It's not due to any one group. It's due to a concerted vision, a vision of restoration, a vision that says, look, livestock can live with carnivores. We have to manage differently. We have to be considerate, and we have to value carnivores. Carnivores, I said it sort of tongue in cheek, but I mean it completely. Elk need wolves as much as wolves need elk. Deer need cougars as much as cougars need deer. They bring the connection. They make the populations healthier. They make the populations more sustainable. They make the land more sustainable. They make the land more sustainable for livestock if humans manage their livestock sustainably. So reaching out to all those communities, we've learned that we need to get the opposition and the supporters communicating right away. We need to have those lines of communication open. We need to discuss. We need to talk with each other, not yell at each other. And we can come to a resolution, I believe, that is good for wolves and is good for the livestock industry.
It's everything that I truly believe, and I know if Stephen was here, he would probably agree with me as well, is that this is really the way forward. And I'm really thrilled to hear this coming from your state, is that this reach out has been going on for years already, and it continues to happen. And you touched on the fact that livestock and wolves can live together. I've had Suzanne Asha Stone on, who gave me some amazing information about coexistence and the work that she's been doing, as well as Kara Vardaman, where she does coexistence ranching. What are some of the things that you in Colorado are trying to implement to assist the livestock industry and even residents who are there who may be a little wary about how to coexist when this all comes to pass in 2023? Are there any specific non-lethal or coexistence plans that you have in place or things that you're working on for both of those areas?
Yes, absolutely. So as simple as it may sound, it's not quite as easy, is to have funding in place to help ranchers pay for implementation of these conflict avoidance strategies. So we are working very hard to figure out funding sources so that ranchers aren't left holding the bag. And that's really critical because change is going to cost, initially, particularly, some revenue. It's going to cost to get range riders. It's going to cost money to change our behaviors and behaviors of cattle, getting range riders out there. So implementation, funding implementation for those coexistence, so-called coexistence conflict avoidance strategies is going to be really critical. Ranching is a historic, vital part of Colorado, and we know from experience that we can have both. There's this really very false dichotomy that it has to be one or the other. I think we're smart enough, and I think we are flexible enough to say, look, and getting that information out there about the value, the essential value of carnivores, the essential value of wolves, and their inherent value as living, sentient creatures is part and parcel of valuing livestock, valuing the ranching community, and valuing the natural world to bring us to a point where we can abandon that false dichotomy where it has to be one or the other. We don't have to conquer. We can actually live together. And so funding is really critical. There's a fella, his name is Matt Barnes, and Matt has been doing kind of this coexistence implementation for a very long time. And he doesn't really focus on tools so much. He focuses on changing our behaviors and changing the behavior of livestock. And that sort of, kind of what he terms reinstilling the herding instinct, using elk, for instance, as a model, using bison as a model, using muskox as a model of what cattle could be doing to protect themselves from large carnivores. And it can happen. And if you look at elk, most of the encounters between wolves and elk are unsuccessful with regard to the wolves. They fail better than 80% of the time. In other words, only about less than 20% of the time are they successful. And it's because elk are big, bad critters. I don't know if you've ever come up against a big bull elk in rut, but it's not something I ever want to do. They're 700, 800 pounds, and they've got big horns, and they've got big hooves, and they kick. So when they stand their ground, elk back off. When bison circle up and put their calves in the middle of the circle, there's no way that an 80-pound wolf, even though there's 5 or 6 of them, is going to take down that bison. It's not going to happen. So getting cows to, and I don't know if if you're in the Midwest and you haven't encountered a cow, I'd be surprised. Cows can be pretty darn mean, particularly when they're around their calves. So getting cows to protect their calves is a really good strategy. A wolf isn't going to take on a healthy 1,200-pound cow. They're going after the calf. You don't want to take on a cow or a bull on your own. You just don't. They're feisty and they're mean. And so retraining us, humans, and retraining cows to protect their calves is one really effective strategy. And there are so many good examples of this working so effectively up in the Northern Rockies. We can bring that here to Colorado. We can do it differently. We don't have to be the same old. We can learn it. What's one of the great things about science is that we build on what we've learned in the past so that we can go forward. We're not stuck in 1900. We can take what we've learned, and that is what enables us to be progressive. We can take that and we can do better. So that's my hope, to make that hope a reality. We are actively outreaching to all communities. getting the facts out there, having the discussion to learn about concerns and how we can address those concerns so that everybody can be made whole.
I think it's such a beautiful way that you're describing it, and it's great to see the more that we do this discussion back and forth that Stephen and I have had with other individuals such as yourselves, that there is this, it seems to be this momentum or this consistency towards inclusion, which is so very much important in society, especially now, that everyone's voice is heard and their concerns are heard. And I find that extremely hopeful for myself as well, being a positive individual, that Colorado is taking the necessary steps. Yourself, you're taking the necessary steps to really make sure that this, while you have time to put a plan in place, it's really good to keep consistently putting the information out there. Is there any myth or common knowledge that people are that really sticks out for a lot of people as to why there's a fear of this or why they're so supportive of it? Do you find that there's more leaning one way or the other, especially those, again, the vote was very, very close. So clearly there's, I'm sure, people still in the middle who might have voted either way, that they weren't too unhappy or they weren't too happy. So what's the biggest roadblock, I guess, you have to get through with just individual residents for this to make it something that they can get on board with?
Let me address one of the myths that supporters of wolf restoration have that may, and I know in several instances, caused them to vote in opposition, although they support wolves. And I'm working, and lots of people, not just me, lots of individuals, lots of organizations are working very hard to make sure that the myth that wolves will come to Colorado and be killed, we're working very hard to make that not a reality. So looking towards the Northern Rockies, where we have, in my opinion, myth-driven slaughter of wolves, we need to be sure that that doesn't happen. And that myth-driven slaughter of wolves in Wyoming and Idaho and Montana is being driven by the myths that have driven our attitudes about wolves for hundreds of years. We haven't abandoned those myths. We need to be absolutely sure that those myths are laid bare, that the reality is brought to the fore. So there's a lot of folks that I know said, no, I love wolves. I appreciate their inherent value, their intrinsic value for life. I appreciate their ecological value, but I can't vote for them because I'm worried that if we bring them to Colorado, the same thing will happen to them here as is happening elsewhere. So that is something that, a factor that we are working really hard to be sure that it doesn't happen here in Colorado. And from my view, the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is that we work really diligently and really honestly and very clearly, very transparently with the ranching community to make sure that they are made whole. So that is my response to that. Another myth I think that really needs to be, and I on both sides of the supporters and the folks that don't support, is the idea that wolves and any carnivore needs to be managed, that their populations will just skyrocket exponentially, and they have to be, and the only management tool that we have is the gun or trapping. Well, that is just not borne out by science, nor is it borne out by the historical evidence of the relationship between wolves and their prey for the past thousands of years. Wolves, unlike us, and I don't mean that tongue in cheek, I mean that very sincerely, unlike humans, wolves self-regulate their populations. And they self-regulate their populations before they reach the capacity, that was the so-called carrying capacity, before they reach the capacity of the environment. They regulate within their family pack, and the family pack strife between the families regulates, so that wolves are, I'd say maybe one of our exemplary populations that do self-regulate within the carrying capacity of the environment, whereas humans, we've greatly exceeded the carrying capacity by various means. So the myth, and that myth, I think, drives, who knows what drives these myths, but is at least partially drives the myth that they need to be hunted. In Colorado, wolves currently, by definition, are classified as a non-game species in Proposition 114, which means that they cannot be hunted. They don't need to be hunted. They will regulate themselves. Other populations, cougars, regulate their own populations. The caveat to that is that, and I'll point to both wolves and cougars because they're both critical to maintaining healthy ungulate populations. The caveat is that they not be persecuted, they not be hunted or trapped or poisoned by humans. The family structure of wolves is so incredibly evolved. And that is what maintains the ability for them to self-regulate. Maintaining that family structure. You know, wolves, I'm going to digress just a little bit here. Wolves are not as athletic a hunter as are cougars. They're not as successful a hunter as are cougars. A wolf's evolved advantage is their behavior. And that specific behavior is cooperation in a family group. If we as humans take away their advantage, that evolved behavior, that family cooperative, social, loyal, fiercely loyal behavior in families, then we eliminate their ability to do what they do best, which is initiate trophic cascades, which moderate ungulate populations, which enable a restoration of ecosystem health. That family pack structure is what is the initial impetus behind population self-regulation. So when we hunt wolves, we undermine that very factor which enables them to self-regulate, which drives that self-regulation. So we need to get rid of that myth that we need to manage. We have, as humans, we seem to think that we can manage the planet. Well, I hate to say it, we're not doing such a good job. And this is an example of where we need to back off and say, wait a minute. Hundreds of thousands of years have resulted in the evolution of this amazing ability, these amazing interactions that have finely tuned this magnificent critter to be able to moderate themselves and consequently to initiate a restoration of ecosystem health, and biological diversity.
I probably couldn't have said it better myself. And I love that you touched on the restoration part of it and the population control end of it. And this, it's like you're reading my mind of where I'm trying to go next. And it's because we spoke to Mike Phillips, and what was interesting that we didn't know until speaking with him is really this restoration project is hoping that it's the connector for the northern part of the country, and that population of wolves, the Montana, Canada, Idaho, down to the Mexican gray wolf, which obviously, as many know who are listening, or if you don't know, I mean, they're critically endangered, and it's really so that there can be that regulation, so that that species could, in some ways, almost recover on its own in the wild. Is that a driving factor, or one of the factors that was being thought about when this prop was being borne out? And then also, obviously, now that it's passed, moving forward, is this one of those things that everyone is saying also as a result, is that these wolves could really be a keystone for their own species in helping down in the southwestern part of the United States?
Yes, definitely. And I think I want to put another little perspective to add on to what Mike Phillips had to say, is that historically, Colorado was not only central to the railroad system, but it was a mixing ground for wolves. We had wolves coming up from New Mexico and Arizona into the southern parts of Colorado, and we had wolves coming down from the northern Rockies. So we had numerous subspecies of wolves in Colorado at one time. We were kind of the hub, the mixing ground of what was happening in Colorado. We had wolves on the Great Plains. We had wolves in the southern Rockies. We had wolves up into the northern part of Colorado. We had wolves all over Colorado, and they were mixing and reestablishing that migration corridor, which is kind of a conceptual aspiration for the project, for instance, 30 by 30, is to reestablish a migration corridor that would enable the movement of not just carnivores, but all of their prey and plants in the face of a warming climate. So, yes, if we could reestablish the physical connections, we would start to be able to reestablish those species connections. So I kind of peripherally spoke about connections and Aldo Leopold and this idea that when you tug on any one little thing, everything else responds. And so we talk about those connections and reconnecting the wolf population as a whole is aspirational, but ultimately, what a long-term goal would look like across the Western North America. And if that could occur, I could see that we could actually not just we could actually be realistically hopeful that we could start restoring that vision of Western North America as the Serengeti of the world, where we think about bison and we can think about elk herds and deer herds recovering to not only their abundance, but the interactions that are essential, those interactions between predator and their prey that created the landscape, that created the wonderful biological diversity. Without the carnivores, without the animals and the plants and the microbes, all we have is nice scenery. We don't have the interactions that enabled the evolution and the creation of the landscape and the beautiful bull elk that we have. You know, it's something that I like to kind of project to people we have hunters, and the big bull elk that's so desirable for so many hunters. That bull elk, the reason that they are so magnificent, the reason that hunters aspire to have that as a trophy is because of the wolf. The selective pressure of the wolf, taking out the weak, removing the vulnerable genetics, is the reason that that bull elk is so magnificent. Wolves, just like we select in husbandry the animals that we want, and we don't let the weak breed, what the wolf does is he removes the weak, and so only the strong survive. The strong are the ones that go on to breed. So hunters should be thankful that wolves are around, because wolves are the ones that gave hunters that magnificent bull elk, which he so covets. Reestablishing those corridors of connectivity, but reestablishing the connection between species, between elk and wolves, and between cougars and deer, and between lynx and snowshoe hare, and so on, is part of this vision. It's aspirational for sure, but there's a lot of folks that have that vision and that are working very hard to make that hope a reality.
Is that your vision of what you believe the future should be?
Clearly. Yes, nature and the natural world is what not only gives us our physical sustenance, it's what makes our lives important, I think, in my view. The intrinsic value of life to us, but only also to itself, most importantly to itself, is what, in my view, is important to restore. It's what's important to work for. It's what I think I, myself, have an obligation to work towards.
It's beautiful. I have one last question for you, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Wildness. The wildness that we all so need in this world. Wolves are wild. And that is perhaps what both excites people about restoration and what worries people about restoration. Wolves are wild. They're not willing to give in to us. And for me, that is what is so hopeful.
I may have to ask one more question though, because you bring up such a beautiful point at the end, is that that's usually our capper, but you say this, and Stephen and I were talking just last night because we're heading out to Yellowstone to do some filming and some podcasting, but we've been discussing this very point of what is it about the wolf that is so, it's such a, I hate using polarizing, but it's such this symbol of, as you said, wild, and it's something that can't be contained, is something that we've sort of discussed, and we have this connection with the domestic dog, and it's the the evolution of the wolf, and why is this such a huge, because it can be based in fear. Why do you feel like that is such a calling card for this specific species? Why is the wildness of the wolf such a flashpoint for everything, it seems, having to do with conservation?
I don't want to be sexist here, but there seems to be and this doesn't hold true always, but what I've seen and what I've experienced often, really from when I was small, is that males like to dominate. And females, and we can take this to the wolf. Females, that is not how they live in the world. They generally, not always, there's certainly a lot of very dominant females out there that live by the sword, but many don't. And I think the rule, what I've known, is that in general, females live more by understanding and by contemplation. The dominance factor, I think, is huge in this. And I'm gonna step way back to when I was a little bit, and on our farm in Nebraska, my ancestors never allowed anything, carnivores or not, to be killed. We farmed, they still do, but my great-grandfather never allowed any hunting on our farm. And they never did. And we learned that we could, I hate to use the word, but it's good, coexist. We didn't try to dominate. And this concept of domination, this concept of conqueror, has permeated our white Anglo culture, for 1,000 years? And I don't know that we have abandoned that. I don't know that we have progressed so far from that mindset. I think that there's a lot of holdover with that mindset in how we deal with individuals, other humans, as well as with the natural world, when that human or that critter won't bow to our authority. And I think wolves don't bow. They know their intrinsic value, and they value their life, and they're not willing to give it up to us. And I think that bothers a lot of people.
That's, again, so well put. Delia, this conversation has been wonderful. I cannot thank you enough for coming on and speaking with me and really going through the nuts and bolts of what's going on in Colorado and sharing your knowledge. Please let everyone know where they can get information about the reintroduction in Colorado, your chapter of the Sierra Club, and if you have any social media or websites where they can go to, please let everyone know where they can find that information.
Absolutely. Please go to Colorado Sierra Club Gray Wolf for information about the Sierra Club and how they can actually join, how you can actually join us in helping get out the word and in helping have that conversation with the entire community of Colorado. Another really top-notch, fact-based website to go to is at Colorado State University at the Center for Carnivore Coexistence. Just Google Colorado State University, Center for Carnivore Coexistence, and then click on Colorado Gray Wolves. So 2 great websites. Please join us. Please become part of the community, whether you support or whether you're still questioning whether this is a good thing. We need to have the conversation. We need everyone involved. And
I love it.
Thank you so much, John. This was delightful. It was a pleasure. And I hope to talk again. And I got to tell you, I'm a little bit jealous that you're going up to Yellowstone National Park.
We are. It's again, the pleasure has been all mine. It's so great to meet you. And we've been discussing Yellowstone for a while, and we pulled the trigger on it. And it's just as you always say, you've put it poignantly in this podcast, it's the evolution of the conversations that we've had, and it's the next logical step in the information that we're trying to obtain and get out there. And this project has really blossomed into something I think myself and Stephen probably, I think we thought in the recesses of our mind this was going to be it, but the fact that it's gotten to where it's gotten so far is great. So I can't thank you enough. And if we could take you, we would. I mean, who knows? Colorado will probably be one of our stops in the future. So if you have anybody who wants to help us out there, we'd love to come by. And obviously, in the next couple of years before this introduction happens, we would love to come out to Colorado and really dive into this conversation even more with yourself and any others who are looking to do it.
Absolutely. There's, I know of lots of people that would love to do that. Please feel free to stop by Redstone. Redstone is a tiny little town on the West Slope. And I am sure that we will hear wolves howling from behind my house, which is surrounded by the White River National Forest. So, contact me, stop by. There are people that would be great, would love to talk with you, and I think would add to the conversation.
Love it so much. This is great. Delia Malone, check out those websites, everyone. Howls to everybody out there, and we will talk to you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.